When Jadine had clicked out of her bedroom in her gold-thread slippers, the man sat down in her chair and lit another cigarette. He listened to the 4/4 time of her clicking shoes, tapping it out on the little writing table. The seat was too small for him, like a grade school chair, even though he had lost the ship food weight, and now, after 2 weeks of scavenging, his body was as lean as a runner's. He glanced around him and was surprised at how uncomfortable-looking her room was. Not at all the way it appeared at dawn, when he crouched there, watching her sleep and trying to change her dreams. Then it looked mysterious but welcoming. Now, in the noon light, it looked fragile, like a dollhouse for an absent doll, except for the sealskin coat sprawled on her bed, which looked more alive than seals themselves. He had seen them gliding like shadows in water off the coast of Greenland, moving like supple rocks on pebbly shores, and never had they looked so alive as they did now that their insides were gone. Lambs, chickens, tuna, children, he had seen them all die by the ton. There was nothing like it in the world, except the slaughter of whole families in their sleep, and he had seen that too. He took another cigarette and walked to a table to look at the presents she'd started to wrap. 2 damp spots formed on the yoke of his pajamas. Still smoking, he left off looking at the packages and walked into her bathroom. Peeping into the shower, he saw a fixture exactly like the one in the bathroom down the hall, but her shower had curtains, not sliding doors. Heavy, shiny curtains, with pictures of old-fashioned ladies all over. Towel material was on the other side, still damp. Water glistened on the tub and wall tile. On the corner of the tub was a bottle of Neutrogena rain bath gel and a natural sponge, the same color as her skin. He picked up the sponge and squeezed it. Water gushed from the cavities. Careless, he thought. She should wring it out thoroughly, otherwise it would rot. The sponge was so large, he wondered how her small hands held it. He squeezed it again, but lightly this time, loving the juice it gave him. Unbuttoning his pajama top, he rubbed it on his chest and under his arms. Then he took the pajamas off altogether and stepped into the shower. "Pull," she had said. Tepid water hit him full in the face. He pushed the knob in and the water stopped. He adjusted the shower head, pulled again, and water peppered his chest. After a moment, he noticed that the shower head was removable, and he lifted it from its clamps to let it play all over his skin. He never let go of the sponge. When he was wet all over, he let the shower head dangle while he picked up the bath gel, pumping the spout above the sponge. He lathered himself generously and rinsed. The water that ran into the drain was dark, charcoal gray, as black as the sea before sunrise. His feet were impossible. A thick crust scalloped his heels and the balls of both feet. His fingernails were long and caked with dirt. He lathered and rinsed twice before he felt as though he'd accomplished anything. The sponge felt good. He had never used one before. Always he had bathed with his own hands. Now he pumped a dollop of bath gel into his palm and soaped his beard, massaging as best he could with his nails. The beard hair tangled and crackled like lightning. He turned his soapy face up and sprayed water on it. Too hard. He stopped, wiped his eyes, and fiddled with the head until he got mist instead of buckshot. He soaped his face again and misted the lather away. Some of it got into his mouth and reminded him of a flavor he could not name. He sprayed more and swallowed it. It didn't taste like water. It tasted like milk. He squirted it all around in his mouth before pressing the button to shut off the water. He got out, dripping, and looking around for shampoo. He was about to give up, not seeing any medicine cabinets, when he accidentally touched a mirror that gave way to reveal shelf upon shelf of bottles, among which were several of shampoo, boasting placenta protein among their ingredients. The man chose one and stood before the mirror looking at his hair. It spread like layer upon layer of wings from his head, more alive than the sealskin. It made him doubt that hair was in fact dead cells. Black people's hair, in any case, was definitely alive. Left alone and untended, it was like foliage, and from a distance it looked like nothing less than the crown of a deciduous tree. He knew perfectly well what it was that had frightened her, paralyzed her for a moment. He could still see those minky eyes frozen wide in the mirror. Now he stuck his head under the shower and wet the hair till it felt like a pelt over his ears and temples. Then he soaped and rinsed, until it was as metallic and springy as new wire. After he dried it, he found a toothbrush and brushed his teeth furiously. Rinsing his mouth, he noticed blood. He was bleeding from the gums of his perfect teeth. He unscrewed the cap from a bottle of Listerine, with instructions in French on the label, and gargled. Finally, he wrapped a white towel around his waist. He noticed another door in the bathroom, and opened it with the easy familiarity of someone who had been there before. It led to a dressing room within an alcove in which stood a table and a mirror circled by lights. Farther along were dresses, shelves of shoe boxes, luggage, and a narrow lingerie chest. On a tiny chair lay shorts and a white tennis visor. The smell of perfume nauseated him. He had not eaten since the gobbling of cold souffle and peaches the night before. He picked a robe, returned to the bathroom, and urinated. Then he stooped to pick up the pajamas, damp and bunched on the floor, but changed his mind, left them there, and walked back through the bedroom. The breeze from the open window was sweet, and he went to it and stood looking out. They are frightened, he thought. All but the old man. The old man knows that whatever I jumped ship for, it wasn't because I wanted to rape a woman. Women were not on his mind, and however strange it looked, he hadn't followed the women. He didn't even see them properly. When the boat docked, he stayed in the closet. Their voices were as light as their feet pattering on the dock, and when he went at last to look, all he saw were two slim-backed women floating behind the beam of a flashlight toward what looked like a jeep. They got in, turned on the lights, then the engine, in that order, just like women would, and were gone. It amused him that these tiny women had handled that big boat. Which one had thrown the rope? Who jumped onto the dock and secured the line? He had not seen them clearly at all, just the hand and the left side of one as she picked a bottle off the deck. And now their slim backs disappearing into the darkness toward a jeep. He hadn't followed them. He didn't even know where they were off to. He waited until the sea, the fish, the waves all shut up, and the only sound came from the island. When he had eaten mustard, flat bread, and the last of the bottled water, he too disembarked, but not before he looked up at the sky, holy with stars, and inhaled the land smell sailors always swear they love. Behind him, to his right, the dim lights of Queen of France. Before him, a dark shore. Ahead, under the stars, and above the black of the beach, he could barely see the hilly outline of the island against the sky. He walked along the dock, and then over 40 feet of sand, past the shadow of something that looked like a gasoline pump, to the road the jeep had taken. He stayed on it, and hoped he wouldn't meet anybody, for having lost his shoes, he was not willing to cut through the bush, fat and tangled by the side of the road. At every step, clouds of mosquitoes surrounded him, biting through his shirt and on the back of his neck. An old dread of mines chilled him, stopped him dead, and he had to remind himself several times that this was the Caribbean. There were no beautiful pygmies in the trees or spring mines in the road. He hadn't followed the women. He didn't even know what they looked like, or where they were going. He just walked for an hour on the only road there was, and saw nothing to make him stop, nothing that appeared to offer rest. At some point during that hour, a foul smell rose about him. But the mosquitoes left him, and he supposed it was the fumes coming from a marsh or swamp that he imagined he was passing through. When he emerged from it, he saw above him a house with lights in its upper and lower stories. He stopped and rested one hand against a tree. How cool and civilized the house looked. After that hot, solitary walk through darkness lined by trees muttering in their sleep, how cool, clean, and civilized it looked. They are drinking clear water in there, he thought, with ice cubes in it. He should have stayed on the boat for the night. But he'd been shipbound so long, and the land smell was so good, so good. I'd better go back, he told himself, back to the boat, where there is a refrigerator and ice cubes in a bunk. He drew his tongue across his lips and felt the cracks. Moving his hand an inch or two up the tree in preparation to go, his fingers grazed a breast, the tight-to-breaking breast of a pubescent girl 3 months pregnant. He snatched his hand away and turned to look. Then he let his breath out in a snort that was more relief than laughter. An avocado was hanging from the tree right at his fingertips and near his cheek. He parted the leaves and stroked it. Saved, he thought. It smelled like an avocado, felt like an avocado, but suppose it wasn't. Suppose it was a variety of ackee, the fruit that contained both a pulp that was edible and a poison that killed. No, he thought, ackee trees are bigger, taller, and their fruit would not grow so close to the trunk. He strained to see the color, but couldn't. He decided not to chance it, and looked again at the house lights, the home lights, beaming like a safe port in front of him. Just then, the wind, or perhaps it was the tree herself, lifted the leaves and, precisely as he had done a moment ago, parted wide the leaves. The avocado swung forward and touched his cheek. Why not, he thought, and placed 3 fingers on either side of the fruit, and bit it where it hung. Under the tough, bitter skin was a completely tasteless, wholly satisfying meat, and it made him thirstier than he was before. He hadn't followed the women. He hadn't even seen them clearly, only their slim backs. What he went toward the house for was a drink of water, to find an outside spigot, a well, a fountain, anything, to quench a thirst brought on by mosquitoes, the hot night, and the meat of a teenage avocado. He approached the house from its northern side, away from the gravel of the driveway and over where the grass was wet and silky under his feet. Through the first window he looked into, he saw not the women, for he was not following the women, but the piano. Nothing like Miss Tyler's, but still a piano. It made him tired, weak and tired, as though he had swum 7 seas for 7 years, only to arrive at the place he had started from, thirsty, barefoot, and alone. No water, no shipboard bunk, no ice cubes could fight the fatigue that overwhelmed him at the sight of the piano. He backed away, away from the light and the window into the protection of the trees that were still muttering in their sleep. He would have sunk where he stood and slept under the dreaming trees in the holy sky, except for the part of him that never slept, and which told him now what it always told him, to hide, to look for cover. So he obeyed the self that never blinked or yawned, and moved farther from the house looking for anything, a hutch, a tool shed, a cloister of shrubbery, and found a gazebo. He crawled under the circular bench where he could sleep safely. But sleep did not join him there at once. What came, what entered the gazebo, what floated through the screen, were the boys who laughed at first when he used to go to Miss Tyler's, and teased him about fucking Andrew's auntie, when all he was doing was playing her piano, because there wasn't another one in town except behind the altars of the AME Zion and Good Shepherd Baptist Church. 2 churches for fewer than 300 people. Drake, Soldier, and Ernie Paul laughed and pointed their fingers. How it feel? Is she good? But he went anyway, because she let him, and because nothing else mattered. And after a while she said she would give him lessons if he would weed for her. And a year later, Drake, Soldier, and Ernie Paul weren't laughing. They were sitting on Miss Tyler's porch steps listening and waiting for him to come out. Cheyenne, too, listened while he played and waited out front for him. But that was much later, and thank God she didn't come into the gazebo with Drake, Soldier, and Ernie Paul. They kept him up all night, practically, so he thought they were probably alive somewhere. Each of them had been afraid for something different. His balls, eyes, spine. He had been afraid for his hands. All through the war, he thought of sitting in a dark and smoky joint, a small place that couldn't pack 100 and could make it with a steady crowd of 30, and him, hidden behind the piano, surrounded and protected by the bass, the drum, the brass, taking 8 once in a while, but mostly letting his hands get to the crowd softly, pleasantly. His hands would be doing something nice and human for a change. After he was busted, discharged, without honor or humor, he had done it, but so badly only the pity of the owner and the absence of a rival kept him there, playing at night while Cheyenne slept at home, waiting. He hadn't followed the women. He came to get a drink of water, tarried to bite an avocado, stayed because of the piano, slept all through the next day because Drake, Soldier, and Ernie Paul kept him awake in the night. That's how he came to sleep in the day and wander the property at night contrary to common sense and all notions of self-preservation. And he stayed tired, even at night when he walked around looking for food and trying to think of what his next step should be. To go back to the boat and wait for one of them to sail it again? To examine the island and maybe find a rowboat, something anonymous, and make it to town at night? Get a little work? Enough to fly to Miami and then work his way back home? To knock on the door, ask for help, and take the risk of being turned in. Each possibility seemed fine, and each seemed stupid. But he was so tired in the day, and so hungry at night, nothing was clear for days on end. Then he woke up, in a manner of speaking. The first night he entered the house was by accident. The broken pantry window, where he was accustomed to look for food and bottled water, was boarded up. He tried the door and found it unlocked. He walked in. There in the moonlight was a basket of pineapples, one of which he rammed into his shirt, mindless of its prickers. He listened a moment before opening the refrigerator door a crack. Its light cut into the kitchen like a wand. He shielded the opening as best he could while he reached inside. 3 chicken wings were wrapped in wax paper. He took them all and closed the door. The silence was startling compared to the noisy night outside. He pushed the swinging doors and looked into a moonlit room with a big table in the middle and a chandelier overhead. It led to a hall, which he entered, and which led to the front door, which he opened, and he stepped back outside. The chicken was incredible. He hadn't tasted flesh since the day he went crazy with homesickness and jumped into the sea. He ate the bones even, and had to restrain himself from going right back and raiding the refrigerator again. Later. Wait till tomorrow night, he told himself. And he did. Each tomorrow night he entered the house, and it was a week before he ventured upstairs, and then it was out of curiosity as well as a sense of familiarity. The door of the first bedroom at the head of the stairs was open. The room itself empty. The one to the left was not empty. A woman was sleeping in it. He meant to look, but not to watch, and not to stay because he had not followed the women. Had not even seen them clearly. So, the first time he entered her room, he stayed only a few seconds watching her sleep. Anybody could have told him it was only the beginning. Considering the piano and Cheyenne and this sleeping woman, he was bound to extend his stay until he was literally spending the night with her, gratified beyond belief to be sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, his shirt full of fruit and meat if he could find any, in the company of a woman asleep. His appetite for her, so gargantuan it lost its focus, and spread to his eyes, the oranges in his shirt, the curtains, the moonlight, spread to everything, everywhere around her, and let her be. He spent some part of every night with her, and grew to know the house well, for he sneaked out just before dawn when the kitchen came alive. And he had to admit now, standing in the sunlight, that he had liked living in the house that way. It became his, sort of, a nighttime possession, complete with a beautiful sleeping woman. Little by little he learned the people, and little by little he forgot that he had not followed the women. He thought he had. Only now did he remember that it was the avocado, the thirst, the piano, and now here he was with the immediate plans of a newborn baby. He didn't like to think too far in advance anyway, but he supposed he'd have to think up a story to tell them about who he was and what his name was. Oh, he had been alone so long, hiding and running so long. In 8 years, he'd had 7 documented identities, and before that, a few undocumented ones, so he barely remembered his real original name himself. Actually, the name most truly his wasn't on any of the Social Security cards, union dues cards, discharge papers, and everybody who knew it or remembered it in connection with him could very well be dead. Son. It was the name that called forth the true him, the him that he never lied to, the one he tucked in at night, the one he didn't want to die. The other selves were like the words he spoke, fabrications of the moment, misinformation required to protect Son from harm and to secure that one reality at least. Through the window on the ground below, he saw the back of a man, stooping at some cutting or digging chore. It was a black man he had seen off and on around the grounds. He stared at his back. Yard man, she called him. That was Yard man's back. He knew backs, studied them, because backs told it all. Not eyes, not hands, not mouths either, but backs, because they were simply there. All open, unprotected and unmanipulable, as Yard man's was, stretched like a smokehouse cot where hobos could spend the night. A back where the pain of every canker, every pinched neck nerve, every toothache, every missed train home, empty mailbox, closed bus depot, do not disturb and this seat taken sign since God made water came to rest. He watched the angle of the old man's spine, and for no reason that he could think of, tears stung his eyes. It astonished him, those unshed tears, for he knew well the area into which his heart was careening, an area as familiar as the knuckle of his thumb. Not the street of yellow houses with white doors, but the wide lawn places where little boys in Easter white shorts played tennis under their very own sun. A sun whose sole purpose was to light their way, golden their hair, and reflect the perfection of their Easter white shorts. He had fingered that image hundreds of times before, and it had never produced tears. But now, watching Yard Man, he was kneeling, chopping at the trunk of a small tree, while he himself was so spanking clean from the roots of his hair to the crevices between his toes, having watched his personal dirt swirl down a drain, while he himself stood wrapped, waist to thigh, in an Easter white towel. Now he was as near to crying as he'd been since he'd fled from home. You would have thought something was leaving him, and all he could see was its back. Slowly Yard Man stood. He turned around toward the house, and for less than a pulse beat, glanced at the trees that grew at the edge of the courtyard. Then he lifted his cap, scratched his head with his ring and little finger, and pulled the cap back on. "Thanks," whispered Son. "One more second of your smokehouse cot might have brought me there at last." While Margaret had been lying in her sculptured bedroom, fighting hunger, anger, and fear, Valerian was in his greenhouse, staring out of the one glass window, imagining what was not so. That the woman in the wash-house was bending over a scrub board, rubbing pillow slips with a bar of orange octagon soap. He knew perfectly well that a washer and dryer were installed there. He couldn't hear the hum, for the music and the drone of the air conditioner in the greenhouse obliterated it, but he could see the steam puffing from the exhaust pipe. But the scrub board, the pillow slips, and the orange soap were major parts of what he wished to see. The backyard of the house of his childhood in Philadelphia. The hydrangea, fat and brown in the September heat. His father, knocked down by a horse-drawn milk truck, lay in bed, the house already funereal. Valerian went out back to the shed, where a washerwoman did the family's laundry. She was thin, toothless, and looked like a bird. Valerian sometimes visited her, or rather hung around her shed, asking questions and chattering. She was like a pet, who would listen agreeably to him and not judge or give orders. The first time he came, she had said, by way of polite conversation, the pointless conversation of an adult without stature to a child who had some, "What's your daddy doing today?" And he had answered that his daddy was away on a sales trip to Atlantic City. From then on, she greeted him that way. He would wander to the shed door, and she would ask, "What's your daddy doing today?" And he would tell her, as a preliminary to the conversation, "He's at the factory today," or "He's in New York today." It was a delightful opener to him, because she and his father had never laid eyes on each other. A sort of grown-up conversation followed the question that they both took seriously. On one of the Wednesdays she came to work, his father died without regaining consciousness. Valerian was fussed over by his mother and relatives, and then left alone while they busied themselves with death arrangements. He wandered out to the wash-house that afternoon, and when the woman said, "Hi, what's your daddy doing today?" Valerian answered, "He's dead today," as though tomorrow he would be something else. The woman looked at him and paused for an awkward silence in which he suddenly understood the awfulness of what had happened, and that his father would also be dead the next day, and the day after that as well. In that instant, while the bird-like colored woman looked at him, he knew limitlessness. The infinity of days in which the answer to her question would be the same. He's dead today. And each day it would be so. It was too big, too deep, a bottomless bucket of time into which his little boy legs were sinking and his little boy hands were floundering. Finally, she blinked and pointed to a shelf behind him. "Hand me that soap," she said, and he did. "Now, unwrap it. Stand right over here. Up close. Closer." He did that too, and she made him rub soap on the wet pillowcase that clung to the washboard. He scrubbed his heart out, crying all the while, pillowcase after pillowcase, rubbed and rubbed until his knuckles were cherry red and his arms limp with fatigue. And when he couldn't do another, she patted him on the head and said she would hire him any day. Later, George, the butler they had before Sydney, found out about it. He had wondered about those cherry-red knuckles, and told him to stay out of there because the woman drank like a fish, and he mustn't let her use him to do her work. Valerian told him to mind his own beeswax, but they let the woman go, and Valerian never again had to say, "He's dead today." But he said it anyway to himself, until his little boy legs were strong enough to tread the black water in the bucket that had no bottom. So, inconvenient as it was, he had insisted on a separate wash-house when he built l'Arbre de la Croix, less for an island touch than for the remembrance of having once done something difficult and important while the world was zooming away from him. Now, another washerwoman came. It wasn't quite the same. No octagon soap, no wavy, gleaming washboard, but he liked looking at it through his greenhouse window, knowing there was a woman in there doing something difficult but useful in peace. A soothing thought to concentrate on, while his own house was prickly with tension and unanswered questions. He had rattled last night to Jade, and why he had ascribed his exile to the Caribbean to the relationship between Margaret and Michael he couldn't imagine. The fact was, he'd become a stranger in his own city, and chose not to spend his retirement there at exactly 65, or close to it, in order to avoid watching it grow away from him. Sidewalks and thoroughfares were populated by people he didn't know. Shops were run by keepers who didn't know him. Familiar houses were bought by bright couples who either updated them or returned them to some era that existed only in their minds. They tore out unfashionable shrubbery for decks and patios. They closed in the wide-open porches and enlarged windows that had been tiny, private, and sweet. These new people privatized their houses by turning them backward, away from the street, but publicized their lives and talked about wine as though it were a theology instead of a drink. The unending problem of growing old was not how he changed, but how things did. A condition bearable only so long as there were others like him to share that knowledge. But his wife, 22 years younger and from another place, didn't remember, and his friends were dead and dying. In his heart, he was still the 39-year-old Temple alumnus working in the candy factory, about to assume from his uncles control of the company, and who had married a high school beauty queen he was determined to love in order to prove he was capable of it to his first wife, that unlovable shrew who was unlovable to this very day. She had died a year before his retirement in South Carolina, where she had gone to live with her sister. When he heard about it, she was already in the ground. He began to miss her at precisely that point, terribly. And when he settled in the Caribbean, she must have missed him too, for she started visiting him in the greenhouse with the regularity of a passionate mistress. Funny. He couldn't remember her eyes, but when she came, flitting around his chair and gliding over his seed flats, he recognized her at once. In 9 years of marriage, she had had 2 abortions, and all she wanted to talk about during these visits was how relieved she was that she'd had at least that foresight. He wished she felt something else. You'd think in death, in the beyond, she would have felt something else, or nothing at all. He was not alarmed by her visits. He knew he conjured them up himself, just as he conjured up old friends and childhood playmates who were clearer to him now than the last 30 years were, and nicer. But he was astonished to see, unconjured, his only living son in the dining room last night. Probably the consequence of describing the sink business to Jade. Michael seemed to be smiling at him last night, but not the smile of derision he usually had in the flesh. This was a smile of reconciliation. And Valerian believed that was part of the reason he invited the black man to have a seat, the forepresence of Michael in the dining room. His face smiling at him from the bowl of peaches was both the winsome 2-year-old under the sink and the 30-year-old socialist. The face in the peaches compelled him to dismiss Margaret's screaming entrance as the tantrum of a spoiled child, the deliberate creation of a scene which both father and son understood as feminine dementia. Michael had been on his heart, if not in his mind, since Margaret had announced the certainty of his visit. He could not say to her that he hoped far more than she did that Michael would come. That maybe this time there would be that feeling of rescue between them, as it had been when he had taken him from underneath the sink. Thus, when the black man appeared, Valerian was already in complicity with an overripe peach, and took on its implicit dare. and he invited the intruder to have a drink. The Michael of the reservation and the Michael of the sink were both surprised and pleased.
This ends side 2 of cassette 4 of Tar Baby. Please fast forward to the end before loading cassette 5.